Hi, my name is Leah Hanson, and I am in my senior year studying psychology at Lyon College. Today, I will be presenting eugenics throughout America's history, beginning in the early 20th century and ending in the present day. I was advised while making this presentation by Dr. Jen Daniels and Dr. Paul Buby. First, it is important to understand social factors that influence the rise of eugenics. In our patriarchal society, educated white men retained power over others and developed a superiority complex. This sense of superiority was justified under the guise of paternalism, or fulfilling the role of a father. The eugenics movement began to take root in America in the early 20th century, with the goal being to eradicate social ills by limiting the number of those considered to be genetically unfit. The ideologies of this movement are comparable to those held by the Nazi Party, including an ideal genetic background. The genetically unfit included many immigrant groups, racial groups, socioeconomic groups, those with mental or physical disabilities, and the morally delinquent. The movement's ideals can be summed up with the 3 Ds of eugenics, which are defective, delinquent, and dependent. Eugenics ideals meant that immigrants with darker skin tones were subject to stricter immigration laws. Madison Grant's hierarchy of race illustrates the attitudes towards various immigrant groups. At the top is Western Europeans, followed by Northern Europeans, Mediterraneans, Asians, and Africans. Many immigrants were met with literacy tests immediately upon their arrival to the United States. This practice began because most of the undesired immigrant groups were illiterate or unable to speak English. This gave Western European immigrants an advantage over the rest, and those who failed the test were denied entry. Relating back to the hierarchy of race, people of color were considered to be of an inferior genetic background. This resulted in those with darker skin tones being disproportionately affected by eugenics. In Mississippi, between 1920 and 1980, black women were the targets of secret hysterectomies. These hysterectomies are referred to as Mississippi appendectomies. The victims of this practice were told that they needed surgery to have their appendix removed, though the real purpose of the surgery was to remove their reproductive organs and forcibly sterilize them. As a result, almost 700 sterilizations were performed. Of the various groups that were discriminated against during the eugenics movement, socioeconomic status seems to be the predominant factor. Out of the 63,000 plus people that were forcibly sterilized under eugenics legislation in the United States, not one came from the upper classes. People with a low socioeconomic status were targeted under the guise of overpopulation because they were considered to be a burden to society. Members of the lower class were manipulated and deemed a burden because of their dependence on large-scale public welfare programs, though the programs had only recently been instituted. Similarly to people of the lower class, individuals with physical and/or mental disabilities relied on public welfare programs, and so they too were deemed a burden to society. This made individuals with disabilities subject to eugenics legislation and the label of socially inadequate. People with disabilities were believed to be incapable of making their own decisions and living amongst the general public. These determinations were based on unreliable IQ tests, as well as educational achievement, reputation, and economic success, all of which do not reliably measure ability. Another group that was marginalized by the eugenics movement and considered to be incapable of living in American society was the socially delinquent. Social delinquents included criminals as well as sexual deviants. At this time, criminality was understood to be a heritable trait, which contributed to discrimination towards this group. This way of thinking made criminals a target for forced sterilization so as to prevent social inadequacy in the coming generations. Sexual deviants included sex workers, single mothers, and homosexuals, as they were considered loose, promiscuous, and sexually delinquent. The intersectionality of these characteristics cannot be ignored. Intersectionality refers to the ways in which the effects of multiple forms of privilege or discrimination overlap. For example, a woman of color receives discrimination based on both gender and race, whereas a white woman receives discrimination based only on gender. Eugenics and intersectionality meant that the poor communities of color in the United States were disproportionately affected by the movement. Similarly, many immigrant Asian, African, and Mediterranean populations were not allowed to enter the United States because of their birthplace and skin tone. Although eugenics legislation ended in the 1940s, the U.S. allowed the forcible sterilization of nearly 3,500 Native American women in the 1970s. Oregon approved its last forced sterilization in 1981, and women received off the books sterilizations in Mississippi throughout the 1980s. Unfortunately, eugenics ideologies still exist in our society today. Immigrant women in ICE detention camps along the U.S. border are being sterilized without their knowledge, and UC Berkeley recently spent $70,000 in funding for a eugenics study on their campus. The citizenship test is comparable to the literacy test immigrants received upon arrival. Felons can sometimes receive a lifelong ban from voting, which is similar to moral delinquency ideologies. Eugenics includes prenatal testing and selective abortions for babies with disabilities. Who gets to say what life is worth living?